好事多磨. That means a good thing should be achieved through a lot of
CGTN headquarters. I'm Yang Zhao with Check It Out Studio. And tonight, we talked about the moon. The lunar sample brought back by China's Chang 5 mission last December have just reviewed some shocking history about the moon. And what are they? What are the implications? Tonight, I'll be joined with several scientists from around the world. Hello, gentlemen. Can you hear me? How about we start up with How about we start with a little introduction about yourself?
Chang.
Hello, Chang.
Okay.
How about we start from you?
Okay. Ross, you first.
你好. My name is Dr. Ross Mitchell. I'm a professor of geology at the Institute of Geology and Geophysics, Chinese Academy of Sciences here in Beijing. And I'm half geologist, half geophysicist. My interest is mainly on the Earth, but I study Earth as a planet, okay? So this allows me to think of other planets like Mars, and obviously the topic of today, the moon. So understanding kind of a whole solar system perspective, what can we learn about Earth from Mars and the moon, and what can we learn about Mars and the moon from Earth?
Okay, great. Thank you, Ross. The Ross Mitchell from the Chinese Academy of Sciences. And Chang, can you introduce yourself? And maybe you can just introduce a little bit about the journal behind you.
Okay. Hi guys, I'm Chang from the Innovation. It's a surplus partner journal of any branches of sciences, and innovation was founded by next generation scientists from the Chinese Academy of Science. We're trying to do something different and significant. So we are trying to make it better and better. And yes, we are on the way to make this journal get more reputation. That's all. Over to you.
Okay. Thank you, Chang. That's Chang, Executive Director from the Innovation, and we also have Richard Palin from the Oxford University. But we have been experiencing some technical problems, so we hope he can catch up with us later. Let me just give you a little bit background on this. The last December, China's Chang 5 lunar probe returned with 2 kilograms of lunar samples, and it marks the first time in over 4 decades, rocks got scrapped from the moon surface and brought back to our surface. And recently, the Chinese scientists and their partners around the world has already reviewed some very impressive results on the assessment of those samples. Ross, can you just walk us through the highlights of those research on the lunar samples so far?
Yeah, sure, Jiayang. Basically, in this first wave of amazing discoveries from Chang 5, we have, interestingly enough, 5 papers published in the last few weeks. One has been published in the China's journal, National Science Review. One has been published in the American journal, Science. And 3 have just been published last week in the UK journal Nature from my institute, IGG. So those 5 results, I'll just summarize quickly. The National Science Review paper, the Chinese journal, very important for establishing that these samples were from a volcano. So the lunar surface has been impacted so many times by asteroids over billions and billions of years. It kind of has a soil, a rough fractured soil. So it's, even though you collected those soil samples, is the soil really comprised of the volcanic material of that region, or is it some other debris? So the first National Science Review paper really established, yes, we're looking at basalt, a rock type we'll talk about today. And Then the science paper was the first published from the Chinese Academy of Geological Sciences here in Beijing. And, they got there first very impressively within a few weeks. And they dated the first age, establishing this 2 billion year old age, something we'll talk about a lot today. And then the 3 papers from my institute, IGG-CAS. First paper was, again, the age, and our results we're quite proud of is very precise. Even though we're talking 2 billion years ago, the uncertainty on our age is only 4 million years, very, very small. And then in the other 2 papers basically took leading hypotheses that people had preferred for explaining how the small moon had survived for so long, and we were able to reject both of them. A big part of science is not just coming up with ideas, but also testing old ideas. So those are kind of the highlights, and obviously we'll explain more as you're interested.
Okay, great. Chenke, we know that whenever a scientist finishes some research or an article, the scientific community will be involved in responding to it. They will write the commentary, they will peer review this result, and I know the innovation have received some commentary. What does this commentary published in your journal say about this work?
Yes. After this 5 papers were published by Science Nation and the National Science Review, you invite this commentary from Rose, Michelle, and we are trying to just now Rose tell the whole story. And actually, as you know, the innovation is an international journal of any branches of sciences. So the university can reach out a huge number of scientists worldwide. That means more than 2 million scientists worldwide reached out, and a lot of scientists expressed their interest in these issues, not just on samples, but also on how they also did the research, and even on moon evolution, blah blah blah. Also, not just from geoscience, but also from life science, medical science, and even management. So, from all disciplines of the scientific community join us to discuss it. So that's a hot issue, and because it's so popular, and it's so popular because it's so precious. We got a lot of feedback. Joy.
Okay, the Ross, as you just mentioned, the samples were collected from basalt areas on the moon. Which is known as Oceanus Procellarum. Am I pronounced correct about this places? Can you just tell us more about this location and why this location is so important? Why the Chinese scientist wants to choose this region?
Hawanti, good question. When we look up at the moon, some people say the moon has a face, or some people say that the moon is made of cheese. That's because the moon is two-toned, it has 2 colors, the very white surface, and then these darker surfaces. So the Oceanus Procellarum that you mentioned is this darker surface. So most of the moon, I'll talk about this perhaps later, most of the moon is this white, it's called anorthosite. But the basalt is this dark color. Okay, and basalt, think of Iceland or Hawaii on Earth, or the ocean crust in between the continents. So basalt is very dense, very dark in color, and Oceanus Procellarum is concentrated. It's this, the reason it was called Oceanus actually was when early astronomers looked up at the moon, they thought the moon had a sea, an ocean. And even though we know that's no longer the case, the name has stuck around, but it is a sea of basalt. And what was specifically interesting about the area within this sea of basalt that Chang'e 5 chose to land in was that among all of the basalts in the region, the one where Chang'e 5 landed was one of the youngest. Okay, so know how I mentioned the asteroids impacting the surface. The longer a surface has been around, the more impacts from asteroids it has. So the team chose an area of basalt that had very, very few asteroid impacts. That told them that maybe this area might be one of the youngest lava flows on the moon.
Yeah, you talked a lot about the basalt, and I have heard about this kind of the rocks for many times when we had talked about the research on the study on the Earth, the study on Mars, and now the study on the Moon. So, what exactly is this types of a rock? Why are you so fascinated about this types of rocks?
Well, basalt, geologists, we tend to use these words primitive or evolved. So primitive, you can kind of think like a caveman, our ancestors many, many years ago, and you and me and Chang here being the evolved species many, millions of years later. So basalts, as you said, are found on every planet, okay? Venus probably has basalt. Moon has basalt, Earth has basalt, Mars has basalt. So that basalt is primitive. If you melt a mantle, the first compositions you're going to get are basalt. And as your crust evolves over time, you melt a basalt, then you can start making more exotic rocks. Eventually you get down to something like granite, which is what the Earth's continents are made of. And the moon doesn't have granite per se, but it does have some rock types that are granite-like. But even within basalt, you can have primitive basalts and evolved basalts. And one of the exciting things about the Chang'e 5 samples is they were less primitive than many of the Apollo era samples sampled by the U.S. program.
Okay, you just mentioned this. All of the samples, this basalt, are just coming from the interior of the moon in the very long ago in the ancient time, and they have been erupted by the volcano on the moon. They're coming from the inside to the outside. It's been buried on the surface, and then they have been scrapped by this Chang'e 5 mission, right? So how can you confirm that those samples, that everything that you collected on the surface of the moon were actually coming from the interior of the moon instead of the other places? They might just come from the other place. How can you confirm that?
That's an excellent question, Jiayang. Since Chang is here, I'll use a biological analogy. So our DNA, okay? DNA, even if your environment changes, your DNA doesn't change too much, or really at all. In geology, we have something like a genetic code, and that comes in the form of isotopes. So different elements have different different species, different weights, and if we're able to measure the different isotopes of critical elements like strontium or neodymium, Sr, Nd, lead, Pd, we can actually kind of get the genetic code, if you will, of the ancestor rock. So if you want to create a crust, you have to melt the mantle, which is the layer below the crust. And the neat thing was when IgG measured the isotopes of lead, for example, or the isotopes of neodymium, what they found were very mantle-like isotopic values. So we knew that, okay, indeed, this volcano actually even though it's at the surface today, it started its life by deep mantle far beneath the surface getting melted. So it's that isotopic genetic code, if you will, that we were able to confirm with several different isotopic systems.
Okay, now I see this. So I think your explanation just helped me to understand why we have to bring those samples back to Earth. because this isotopic testing cannot be done by those satellites on around the moons, but we have to bring those back to the lab on Earth. Am I right?
Chang, you could be part of the Planetary Science Planning Committee.
I think so.
Yeah. No, wow. Yeah. There's a lot of things we can observe from orbit, okay? You know, the abundance of different elements. We knew, for example, that this Oceanus area was enriched in certain elements, but that those isotopes, those critical isotopes, you're right, you really need a sample return.
Yes, because the last time I checked up with
Chang, you are very smart, and yes, maybe in the coming future he will take part in your lab research, because like genetic code is so important for human life, and maybe you will find the isotype in the next moon rocket. That should be amazing, but it's so harsh.
Yeah, because the last time I checked with I got this chance to visit your lab in IG in the CS, and the isotope the equipment was so large, it was occupied the whole room. So so that was the really that was the really big equipment, so you cannot just to bring them to the orbits of the moon, obviously. And also, Russ, I wanted just to talk a little bit about this the Chang 5 sample and the previous samples collected by the Apollo mission and also the lunar missions. Can you just tell us about the differences between them? Are they also collected basalt, as you said, same as what Chinese scientists are collecting this time?
There's similarities and there are differences between Apollo samples and Chang'e samples. Apollo, first of all, really targeted some of the oldest rocks on the moon, being interested in the origin of the moon. And Apollo did an excellent job of collecting very, very old samples. But the youngest samples that Apollo collected were only just a bit younger than 3 billion years old. So the obvious biggest difference between the new samples from Chang'e and Apollo is their age.
And this time
Chang'e,
is 2 billion years old, right?
That's right.
This time is 2 billion years old. Okay.
So this makes this extends the lifetime, if you will, of volcanic activity on the moon almost 1 billion years. About 800, 900 million years to be exact. So the biggest difference is the age, and then the second difference is, as we mentioned, the kind of primitive versus evolved compositions. These are the first basalts from the moon that you would begin to call less primitive. So in a magma chamber, you have different generations of eruptions, okay? And as eruptions happen over time, certain minerals that form early leave the system, and minerals that get left in the magma chamber get concentrated. So these samples are really evidence that the magma chambers on the moon had been active for long enough that they had started to change the composition of basalts.
Okay, so can we just say whenever the volcanoes were active within the moon, can we just if the volcano is still active, will the scientists will consider that the moon alive, or now we consider it dead because it's burned out and cooled down? Can we say that?
Well, yeah. It's kind of like a pulse, okay? If you want to know if someone's alive or dead, what's the first thing you do? You check their pulse, right?
Yeah, pulse.
Yeah.
Heart rate.
And volcanism is really kind of the meter stick for knowing if a planet is alive. Venus has lots of volcanism still. Earth has lots of volcanism still.
Right.
Mars does not. And
Yes.
so when we take the pulse of the moon, we're really looking for the last large volcano.
Yeah, Russ. That just remind me about the study with Mars exploration, because somebody say the Mars cooled down and losses what has been called O'Donnell effects inside a very long time ago, because it's relatively small size and relatively light its mass. But well, at the same time, its sister, the Earth, which is big enough to preserve its heat, can still alive today. Is this true? Just because of its
Yeah.
size and mass?
So Venus is almost the same size of Earth, and both of us are still volcanically active. So I brought in. I figured you might ask this question, so I brought in a little apple. Okay.
Okay. Okay.
And what's important is the ratio between a surface and the volume inside. And believe it or not, if you make this pinguo smaller, if you make this apple smaller, okay, you still have quite a large surface, but the volume is much smaller than when I had the big apple. So the volume is what's holding all of the heat inside, and the surface is what is losing the heat to space. So at the smaller and smaller radius, from Earth down to Mars, down to the moon, you still have a large surface, but a very small volume. So the smaller the radius of the planet or moon, you expect it to cool much faster.
Okay, but if that is the case, I think the moon seems to be a big exception, because it's much more smaller, it's much more lighter, but its lifespan turns to be a little bit more longer. So what are the reasons behind that?
Excellent question. Mars, which is much bigger than the moon, okay,
Yes.
it had volcanism maybe to 2 billion years, but really its last large volcanism stopped at 3 billion. So it's even bigger, and it might not have even lasted as long as the moon. So your question's excellent, and that's kind of the most exciting thing that's coming out of Chang'e 5 is a new dilemma to answer. Science, you answer one question and a new one comes up.
But it's your
what
job.
happens when
I
you
mean,
get
it's
data.
your job as
That's it.
scientists, the job to answer all of these new questions, right? So I have to read this several of these very impressive articles, and they mention some hypotheses that come up with the scientists. The one is saying that the radioactivity, the radioactive elements played a major role and prolong the lifespan of the moons. Can you just tell us a little bit about that? It also mentioned something, this substances which has been known as creep, KREEP, which is very unfamiliar with all of us. Can you just explain a little bit about what exactly is the creep? Why those radioactive elements could play a major role in prolong the lifespan of the moon?
Yeah, I don't want to creep you out, but one of the reasons we picked this spot was because it was in the creep terrain. So what is creep? The K stands for potassium, like in your banana, the element. REE are rare earth elements, a certain type of element that likes to stay in the magma and not be made into crystals. And the last thing is phosphorus. Okay, phosphorus is very important as a fertilizer, but the most important is the K, because K is one of those radioactive elements that you mentioned. And thorium, uranium, these are the big three. Those elements are radioactive. They have their decaying over time at a certain consistent rate, and when they decay, they release heat. So there was this old standing, because it is a good idea. You look at this region of the moon, and from the orbital observations, we know that there's a lot of heat-producing elements at the surface of the moon. But then the question comes, do you have the same amount of heat producing elements in the mantle? Because that's where you need to melt the mantle to create the volcanism. And that's one of the exciting things of one of the CAS nature papers, where they say there's a non-creep origin for the creep terrain. So what they found is, even though the rocks at the surface are very enriched, very rich in this heat-producing elements, when it comes down to the mantle source, they're very, very low. So how can that be? You can start with a magma that doesn't have much potassium, much thorium, but as volcanic activity happens over time, the younger batches of magma can get concentrated a little more and a little more and a little more, so that the surface lava is actually quite different from the melt that was created in the mantle to begin with.
Okay, so that's how they how scientists have ruled out this hypothesis, right?
It was a really old. I mean, it was every good idea is elegant and completely wrong sometimes.
But I still like this hypothesis.
Well, it probably, even though we've ruled it out for Chang'e 5, it doesn't rule it out for other rocks. So this is I guarantee you there's going to be some people who love that idea still and are going to say, okay, now we need another lunar mission to another region. So, you're right. It's ruled out for a very important area, but it still will linger.
Oh, I didn't realize that before, because, so technically speaking, it can just be ruled out in the case of Chang'e 5, but it still have the possibility in other areas where in the future it still might be the real answer.
But I wouldn't place my bet on it, because this was the best place. If you would have found it, you would have found it here. So if you didn't find it here, probably abandon the idea. It's as close to definitively ruled out as possible, I would say.
Okay, so and another theory is this area where China's lunar probe landed might be holding a large amount of water in the mantle. So can you explain why water matters in this process of Moon's thermal evolution? So is it just a cooling
We've been
down?
Talking about, yeah. We mentioned melting the mantle, okay? If you add water to a rock, it will typically melt at a much lower temperature than if it didn't have water in it. So with the same amount of heat, you can create magma at a much lower. So even if the moon was cooled quickly, you could still create magma and there are some measurements from the Apollo era where the mantle of the moon had as much water as Earth's mantle. But there were also other measurements where it was much, much drier. And that's where Chang'e 5 came in, and being the youngest one, which one is it going to be? Is it going to be the wet type or the dry type? If it's the wet type, then yeah, water could be part of that explanation, but it was bone dry, as we say. So at the young age, there's not enough water to lower the melting temperature and give us the volcanism. So another idea that we have to abandon for these basalts.
Okay, so Chinka, I really want to hear about your comments about those hypotheses. I think for me, I mean, I'm not a scientist, but for me, I think those hypotheses, even though they have been ruled out in this case, but I still think they're very, very impressive. They're very, very bold. And what's your comments?
Hear me?
And yeah, I can hear you. What's your comments on?
Okay.
What do you think about those
A couple
very
of years
bold?
ago, a couple of years ago, when your colleague told me that the soil is derived from rocky, I was I realize it's amazing because I have no idea, totally have no idea. So when you saw the moon sample from Chang'e 5, what do you think is rocky or is soil? It's soil or it's rocky from Chang'e 5.
It's soil in the term that it's not rock. So as soon as you start weathering a rock and breaking it down, you start forming a soil. It's not soil in the way that you think with organic matter like we have on Earth, but so it's a bunch of fragments of rock. So it's technically speaking, it's a soil, but those fragments are made of rock.
Okay, I got you.
Yeah.
Because a lot of scientists are interested in this issue, and what's next studies to do about the Chang'e 5 sample? What's your opinion?
Well, we talked about water being able to lower the melting temperature of the mantle.
Yeah.
And there are some other tricks, other things, other ingredients that you can put in the mantle that might be able to also lower the melting temperature. Now, I can't say anything more. My colleagues at CAS.
But you do know something, right, Ross? But you do know
Yeah, I
something.
think so. He knows something. Okay, maybe there are so many secrets behind the moon soils. Maybe a lot of paper will publish in the near future. Do you think so?
Ross, let me just keep asking this question. In addition to the radioactivity, in addition to the radioactivity and water hypothesis, I heard at the very beginning you got you got to have more hypothesis than that. But now we just have like 2 hypotheses that has been appeared in this journal. But earlier you have more hypothesis. Somebody told me that you have like over 50 hypotheses to explain why moon has such a long lifespan. Can you just tell us a little bit more about this? What other hypotheses that you have been ruled out at very early stage?
Well, I won't give all 50. I'll highlight 2.
Okay.
And I'll highlight 2 that are still alive that need to be ruled out by future studies.
Okay.
So we talked about the soil, you know, that surface of the moon being very impacted by asteroids. Well, all those impacts make the surface of the moon very fragmented, and all that airspace between the rock fragments actually makes it a very bad conductor of heat. You know, instead of like a metal, a steel, or a copper that directly takes all the heat from the interior and, you know, conducts it out to space, the surface of the moon, this fractured surface, is a really, really bad conductor. So the heat is kind of has a lid on the top of it. So that's, you know, a shallow example, a shallow hypothesis that people haven't ruled out yet. And the other hypothesis that I'll give you is a more deep explanation. You know, the interior of the moon, the core, and the lower mantle that contains the heat, the heat is getting to the surface by convection. You know, this is just like in Earth's atmosphere or in your oven at home when you're cooking. You know, the heating element at the bottom the hot air rises and the cold air sinks. One possibility is that the convection in the mantle of the moon, for some reason, might be very, very slow. And if it's very slow, it takes a much longer time for the interior heat to get to the surface. So there's kind of 2 ideas that hopefully we can find ways to test with this new sample set from the moon.
Oh, that's also very interesting hypothesis. So Russ, can you just tell me what's your personal interest in the moon? I mean, you're not directly involved in this research, right? So what's your personal? But you might have your personal interest about this. What kind of a secret do you want to review about the moon?
Well, so my expertise on Earth is the supercontinent cycle. You know, all the continents were once together in the Pangea supercontinent, and then they drifted to the continents that we have today. It turns out that Earth has had several cycles. Okay, so
Yep.
we've had three supercontinents, and that cycle continues back in time, and it's very much connected to what we were just talking about, mantle convection. And so one of my interests is what can we learn about mantle convection without plate tectonics? So the moon doesn't have plate tectonics, and it still has mantle convection. Earth has plate tectonics today, but there's a huge debate whether the very, very early Earth had plate tectonics. So by understanding mantle convection on the moon in the absence of plate tectonics, it's almost like a way of studying ancient Earth.
Okay.
Maybe,
Thank
Zhao
you.
Yan, cycle is so important because if Earth got some cycle from Moon, and I mean from Moon or Earth, there will be another big paper for the whole society, scientific society.
Okay, thank you so much
There
for letting
could
us
be-
know. And as we know that this job is not only done by the Chinese scientists, but also have been involved in many scientists from many other parts of the country, many other parts of the world. So, what do you think is what's your opinion about this international scientific cooperation? What does this kind of a cooperation mean for the lunar research in the future, guys?
Well, I would definitely commend the Chinese scientists for the amount of international collaboration that they have allowed and embraced. So my colleagues just down the street here in Beijing at the Chinese Academy of Geological Sciences, on their science paper, they had scientists from Australia, UK, America, some of the leaders in lunar research. We tried to get Richard here today. He's from Oxford. Him and his student are exhilarated with the new samples. The Apollo era was really exciting, not just to Americans, but to anyone that looks up at the moon. And so what has begun now, the Chang era, will no doubt inspire scientists. So it's really exciting to see China and journals like Innovation in China become the center of international scientific collaboration.
Okay, so Chinko, what's your take on this, on the scientific cooperation in the lunar research?
Sorry?
I just wanted to ask you what's your take on the scientific cooperation on the lunar research?
Oh, yeah. Scientific collaboration is so important because in the world, so many issues need to be resolved by a lot of scientists from different disciplines. As to a lunar sample, it is also the same case. We need a scientist from geology, geophysics, geoscience, maybe from life science to do something different previously. So we're trying to get some quick idea. Maybe it's wrong, but that's okay. But we're trying to get together and to do something significant. So genetic code is so important. If you got the biology sample from your doc, tell me. It's big news. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Ross, and thank you, Chinko. I think that's we can call it a day. It's a very informative conversation about what we learn about our moon and what's the. So we have no more about our moon, and we have solved some problem, but we have generated more problems to be solved in the future. Right, thank you so much, and we have the Ross Mitchell from the Chinese Academy of Science, and we also have Chinko, the Executive Director of the scientific journal, The Innovation. Thank you so much, and we hope next time the Richard Palin from the Oxford University could join us in the near future. Thank you so much for everybody. Good night.
Thank you,
One
Jaya.
more. One
Thank you,
more.
Shanker.
Bye bye. Thank
Bye-bye.
you.